Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we're taking a look at the Saucony Freedom Crossport. Let's run with it. Before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, no one had a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. And I would like to say, please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. This is the Saucony Freedom Crossport. Last year it was called the Saucony Freedom 5. They changed the naming convention this year. They dropped the number and just added the term Crossport. So it's the Freedom Crossport, and as the name implies, it's a cross-functional shoe. It's meant to do high-intensity workouts, lifting, sports, and running. Kind of does a little bit of everything, and while it looks like a running shoe, I think it performs quite well in all these different categories, and we'll get into it here. This shoe costs $150. It has 27 millimeters of stack height in the heel width, 23 in the forefoot, giving us a relatively low 4 millimeter drop. Now, if you're a fan of Saucony shoes, you'll know most of them have an 8 millimeter heel to toe drop, and I think the reason they brought it down to 4 with this model is it gives you a bit more stability. I think makes it more stable, especially if you're using it in the gym. Something that really surprised me is this shoe only weighs 8.6 ounces, which is pretty good for a running shoe and amazing for a cross training shoe. Most cross training shoes are in like the 10 to 11 ounce range, and for this to come in at sub 9, I think is amazing. A big fan of Saucony's uppers, and the Crossport is no exception. They do have a rather interesting material here. It's a very fine plastic mesh with heavy lines of stitching, creating a checkerboard-like pattern to give you extra security. And on the inside, they have this very thin line of engineered mesh fused directly to the upper you see on the outside. I do have to say the breathability here is like a 10 out of 10, and is probably more breathable than most running shoes. Because that plastic mesh and internal engineered mesh are so thin, it allows for excellent ventilation, unlike most other training shoes, which for whatever reason just aren't that breathable. So I think as far as breathability goes, it's again a 10 out of 10, and I was quite happy with it. The Saucony Freedom Crossport does fit true size, and I was quite happy with the amount of room in the toe box. It wasn't too wide, wasn't too narrow, it was kind of like that happy medium. You have enough room for your toes to kind of splay out when you're weightlifting, yet it wasn't too wide up in the toe box where it felt like your foot was sliding around on a quick cut or turn. Now, as far as the rest of the lockdown and security of the upper, I think it works quite well, especially with this kind of very unique upper. It feels like you're very connected into this platform. The heel counter is incredibly secure, and the tongue does a good job of staying in place, as it is partially gusseted with 2 large strips of engineered mesh, one on the lateral side and one on the medial side. My only minor gripe about the upper is I wish the tongue had maybe a bit more padding. Saucony does this in general. They have very minimal tongues, and I wish they would just kind of give us a bit more padding through the tongue itself. Not a deal breaker, but if you're tying the laces very tight, you can kind of feel them through the tongue just because it's a small strip of engineered mesh, and if they added in maybe a little bit more padding, I think we'd be good to go. Moving on to the midsole, we have PWRRUN PB, which is the P-back-based material. It's one of their lightest and bounciest foams. We see it on the Endorphin Speed, we see it on the Endorphin Pro, which are like their fast race day shoes. Now, to have it here on a training shoe, I think is quite interesting. In my opinion, it doesn't feel as expressive or as, I guess, lively as you will compared to those running shoes. I think that's for a couple reasons. One, it might be a different version of PWRRUN PB, but I think the main reason is we have full comprehensive rubber coverage on the outsole, which kind of restricts the foam and doesn't allow it to be as soft and bouncy compared to what we see again on like the Endorphin Pro and the Endorphin Speed. The midsole is rather flexible and moves with your foot fairly easily. You also have a good bit of rocker geometry here, which flows you along nicely and is quite pleasant while you're running. I will say while you're doing lifting, having this amount of toe spring probably isn't ideal. Typically, if you're doing true lifting or some heavy weights, you want a bit of a flatter experience and a more firm midsole. However, they did add a couple things to make the shoe a bit more stable while you're training in the gym. The first thing they did is they did some contouring to the midsole. So your foot sits lower in the foam itself, giving you some walls of foam on both the lateral and medial side, gives you a bit more stability. And when you sink lower in, it kind of grips your foot, or at least that's how it felt for me. They also added some additional rubber on the lateral side of the midsole to kind of help you if you're making a quick cut or turn. I did feel like it helped. It gives you just a bit more stability on that lateral edge. You also have a really wide base in both the forefoot and heel area, so you have a lot of surface area to land on, which I think is very helpful. Now, in my opinion, when using this shoe, it's a fine running shoe. I think gets the job done. It's not as bouncy like we talked about before compared to like the Speed 3 or the Pro. So I think people who want a true running shoe, you probably would want to bump up to that. But for being a cross training shoe and for how light it is, it's a solid running shoe. And I was quite happy with this version or this setup of PWRRUN PB. It flows along quite nicely and just feels much more pleasant compared to EVA foam, which I think most training shoes use. When it comes down to it, I think the Crossport is a rather versatile shoe and very unique for its particular category. If we had strength training shoes on one side and running shoes on the other, I think the Crossport kind of lends itself more towards the running shoe line. That PWRRUN PB midsole, while not as expressive as something like the Speed 3 or Pro 3, I think is much more lively compared to conventional EVA foam midsoles found on cross-training shoes. It's also incredibly light at 8.6 ounces, which I found to be probably one of the biggest pluses of the shoe, and the breathability was superb, which I think is important because most of the times gyms are quite stuffy. The runability was quite good. It's not amazing, I think, compared to the rest of the Saucony running shoe lineup, but that makes sense mainly because the shoe also has to be rather stable and have a rather solid amount of outsole rubber to give you some good grip on the court. Now, when it came to those hit exercises and I think doing some of those lateral cuts, I was actually surprised with how well it performed, considering it has the bouncy or rather bouncy PWRRUN PB foam here. It's softer and bouncier compared to its peers in this kind of hybrid category, but if that's something you're interested in, or if you just like to have a little bit more cushion in your cross-training shoes, I think the Crossport might be for you. I was also really happy with the lockdown and fit of the upper. Again, Saucony really does an excellent job here, and I do wish maybe the tongue had a bit more padding, but I think that's a minor gripe. And the outsole traction, again, plenty of rubber coverage. I think it worked quite well on those more conventional surfaces that you find in the gym. I wouldn't necessarily take this out to like gravel or trail running. I think that's probably where this falls short, but I don't think this is intended for that. And I'll also say, again, this isn't for super heavy lifts. If you're doing max super, I guess, deadlifts, squats, or anything like that, I'd probably go for a more traditional, more stable, more firm shoe. But for those hit workouts like Orange Theory or I don't know, F45 or those types of classes, I think this will be right up that alley. Or if you're someone who just wants one shoe to kind of go maybe play tennis, pickleball, volleyball, and then maybe go for a run and then go to the gym, I think this is a solid option. And maybe on top of all that too, I'd probably say this is a solid casual shoe too, just because of the amount of cushioning and just the overall comfort with the upper. So rather versatile. I think it's kind of a master of none, but kind of the jack of all trades. And I would just keep that in mind if you're looking at the Crossport, which was previously called the Freedom 5. So in my opinion, it works quite well. And I think I'm definitely going to keep this in the rotation if I'm going to the gym and I'm not doing anything too crazy. I think I'll probably grab this and just kind of, do some mobility work, some light plyometrics and things like that. I think this is where the Crossport will kind of fit into my just general rotation. So let me know down in the comments, what do you think of this type of shoe in the category that it falls in? I would love to hear from you because this is rather unique. Well, I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.